Thank you, Simon, so much for the generosity and the great reception and everything. And thank you for having us today. Yeah. Okay, so thank you everyone for being here today. We will talk today about embracing individual differences, heterogeneity, and complexity in education research. It's a little bit of a complicated topic, and actually complex, and complexity is complexity. So there will be a lot of technical things today, but they're not really meant to be technical. They're meant to be to show you how things and look at the big picture, not the small details. So whatever there is, it's just there for showing you the things. So almost 100 years ago, people in education started to predict students' performance. It hasn't started with the learning analytics community. It started 100 years ago when the quest was to use some indicators to explain things. And when we predict things, we can definitely intervene because we know that these indicators lead to something. Ever since, until LAC started and revived the idea again that we'll find somebody at risk and we'll predict that before it happens, and with some indicator that, like, for example, this paper of Shane Dawson and McFadden, 2010, mine in LMS, to develop an early warning system. And the idea is really, really catching that we can predict something before it happens. And it's something that really humanity has been obsessed with over a really long time, that we can predict something before it happens. And if you do that, you can become like something like a prophet or something. Yesterday, possibly you've been through the American elections and no one actually predicted that sweeping victory for Trump. Although we had so much data, so many polls and so many everything, we still couldn't predict. But anyway, and everybody did this predictive learning analytics paper. This is my first learning analytics paper about predicting student performance, and I was so excited. But then I got very bored after it because so what? What we discovered after that is that these models, when we take them from a course to another course, are not portable. I mean, yeah, what happens in that course not necessarily happen in the next course. And this has been confirmed a lot. And if I look at the literature, I found paper from 2008, 2017, this really very famous paper that I like very much for Rihanna Konyen from the Netherlands, which was actually rejected at LAC. That shows, yeah, when we use predictors across courses, we can find some of them that is really very strongly positive, some of them that's not even statistically significant, some of them are actually negative. And every course has its own setup, and not any two courses sharing the same type or number of predictors that are significant. And this 17 courses paper is really, really very highly cited. That, yeah, whatever we found in that course will not apply in the next one. And this a paper we published 2022 with Dragan, Yelena, and others. The paper shows actually, for example, this indicator frequency of clicking. You see it really highly significant here, not significant at all, and actually on the negative in that side. And in every course, the same predictor kind of varies and dances right or left. Does it make learning analytics really something that we can trust? There's still hope that we can use this data to do something. That's a really big question. If we get this picture all the time, predictors dancing right and left. These are the same students, same course, same everything. It's really, really very structured courses because these are medical courses. And these guys have programs that run through tons of hours of approval and structuring and really tight locked curriculum that hardly changes from between iterations. And it's not only about education. When people try to replicate scientific findings, they found that not really possible or easy. For example, this is a very famous paper. It's called Open Science Collaboration, and they try to replicate some paper. This is the p-value of the papers that are the original ones, and these are the replications. And you can see the replications are almost around, sometimes high and low, but all the original papers were all above the 0 line. And if you look at the p-values, the p-values here are from 1 to almost 0, a little bit below 0. But here, the p-value of the original papers are all below 0. So replications failed miserably. This is another paper, looked at 5 very highly regarded journals and tried to replicate papers, and whatever below the line didn't replicate. And this was not just random journal. This is one of the highest journals, or 5 of the highest journals in social sciences. You go like this. My previous version of that presentation had 10 slides of really massive replication that all were massively failing and miserably failing, I would say. So social science doesn't replicate. What we find here, we can't replicate it really in a similar way elsewhere. So why this is happening? I will do some 2 stories or something about that, and something about Norma. And this is really a very nice story. They wanted to get a very typical woman, a model woman, a woman that represents the average, beautiful, fantastic, wonderful woman, American woman to be exact. So they picked around 2,000, about 15,000 women actually, and they took measurements of them. And you would imagine 1930 or something, who are the women that were selected exactly? Between 21 and 25, and took their measurements, and they were able to get the measurement of the absolute perfect woman, and they made actually a sculpture from that. And then they announced the prize for women to apply to get that exact woman. They have a woman in imagination that's perfect on everything, average measurement of the 15,000 women, and they wanted to find the actual woman that matches this model. And they announced a really high prize. They couldn't get this woman. 3,700 women applied. They couldn't get her. They got only Martha Skidmore, which is a cashier, and you can find she's a little bit different than the original Norma, which means that average doesn't exist at all. If you get this average or try to actually find it in life, they did it. They give Martha the money anyway because they wanted to create this. And ever since, women are suffering from bad clothes sizing. As you can see, this article published 2 years ago, a 1930 eugenic experiment of the reason women clothing sizes are so damn frustrating because of these typical sizes. And this article, actually a book, is really very interesting. So by this, we know that when we take data from many people to get an average picture, that average picture, we couldn't get it. But there is a much more interesting one, because this experiment led them actually to use this average measurement that they couldn't find them in real life to actually represent women in clothing. So although the experiment technically failed, but they still did that in real life, or took the results of this experiment in real life and created clothing and sizes based on this experiment. Another one, and this is a very, very interesting one. 1940s, the US Air Force found that planes fall without technical fault. They suddenly fall out of the skies, and planes are really expensive. Some pilots were saved, and they said, no, the plane was really good, but we couldn't move well and manipulate the plane. And this is from a very famous book by Ted Rose called The End of Average. I'll just minimize. So, and they said this narrow cockpit is probably the problem. So they hired some person, a Harvard anthropologist, I think, to measure people. And he measured around 4,000 pilots and took 140 dimensions for every person. He wants to get the average best measurement of the pilots to make the cockpit or redesign the cockpit to get this really, really perfect measurements, because the last measurement they did 1926, and they thought, you know what, 15, 20 years, Americans have changed their lifestyle and food and what not. And after he did this experiment, he found something very interesting. He found that nobody matches this measurement. Even more, he chose 3 measurements, arm's length, chest, and legs, and said, okay, these are 3 measurements. Let's see who actually matches the average or this perfect measurement. He found only less than 3.5% of the pilots matched these 3 measurements. So he ended up doing something really cool. He said, okay, there is no average, and there is no one who represents this average. So possibly we could do something called adaptive design. So he made a cockpit that can adapt a large person and a small person. And ever since we had this adaptive design, whenever you are in an airplane, you can advance the seat. Whenever you are in a car, you can advance the seat, and you have this adaptive design. And that was opposite to the previous experiment, which still enforced this average picture. Here he said, no, there is no average anything. This average idea is really not of real life. So the first thing I said is that usually our statistics try to match us to an average, but that average is quite imaginary and doesn't really exist. The second thing is that our statistics usually consider us kind of in a really very summary way. I will give a little bit of an example. This is still another example from Tudor's book. And even when we see something like IQ, an IQ, for example, of 107, if you can see here, you can see people differ within this 107. And he called it zigzag model or jag profile model. Even when we share some kind of a score, this summary score, we differ inside of it. And if you go into 100, 1,000 people, yes, you get an average picture, but that average picture doesn't really capture our individual differences because, again, we are difference complex. Okay, I will skip this one. So because we have individual differences and we are different, these results do not apply to most of us or many of us. And that's why we have to embrace that we are heterogeneous. I will give another example. If we, for example, take this large sample, which is heterogeneous sample, everyone is represented by a point. And if we take this part of a sample, we get this 0.31 as an effect size. If we take another part, we get around 0.15%. If we get that, we get even -1. If we take the whole sample, we get the true effect size, which is 0.07. So because we are heterogeneous, and when you take a sample, and that sample is not really random most of the time, or not random enough, or you don't get every variation in the data, it depends upon when you look, on where you look, not actually representing us, because we are, again, heterogeneous, we are different. And this is a very nice study that, again, not only we are heterogeneous, but some of us are completely unpredictable. And this study found that 10% of people are completely unpredictable by any model. The very interesting thing is that the 90% who are predictable varied, but the unpredictable were completely reproducible. I said before that we can't replicate studies really easily, but that study proved that the unpredictable is actually reproducibly predictable. So they were able to each and every time mispredict these people, but sometimes hit and miss the other ones. So again, we have really some differences. Okay. So we talk now that our data does not really represent us really well, and we have individual differences. And the second thing is that the data that are collected from many people do not apply to individual people. And that's for, I will try to make this a little bit simple. Or there are people who would like to be admitted, sorry. For 3 reasons. The first one we call ergodicity. And ergodicity means that for data really to generalize to many people, we need to be similar. And you've seen before this JAG profile things, but we're not really similar. The second one is that stationarity. Stationarity means that we don't change in time. And we know that we change in time. So the whole idea that data collected from a large group of people apply to individuals, you need to get these two conditions. The third one is ecological fallacy. And I've seen a very interesting slide yesterday from Liz. I will share it with you today to explain what ecological fallacy is. So Liz showed me something very interesting. She asks many students to code their sense of identity on a triangle. And they can, for example, add a point here, add a point here, add a point here that says, for example, how it is connected to the three angles of the triangle. Self-identity as a person, self-identity as someone working in my discipline, willingness to preserve in my studies. Somebody, for example, can put the weight of his belonging or her belonging here, somebody here, somebody here. What we see now is the average picture of that. And when we get the average picture, we think that the average student in UTS can be represented by that triangle. Yes? That's what we get, the means and medians. We call them central tendency, that everybody tends to be around that mean or median. But if we look at the actual data, this is the data. So when we have this average, and we think that this average actually represents everyone, or everyone is close to this average, that's an absolute ecological fallacy, because it technically represents no one. And this is really a huge concept in social sciences. There are many examples you can think of it like this. If you have a classroom, for example, you introduce some fantastic technique, some students improve, you get the average, I don't know, 10% increase, you think that everybody in the class increased, but this is not really the case. Maybe 10, 20% increase, 5% decrease, but when you get the average of them, you get that picture. And you think that this works for everyone and improved everyone by 5%. No, really. Some people improve, some people not. And it's not like that. Okay. And that's what I just said. That's why there is lack of group to individual generalizability. Because we usually collect data from a group of people, and we think that this data collect or applies to these people. And this is what we call group-based research that we do all the time. We get data from a cross-sectional people, and we think that these differences here mirror these differences here. I will try to explain it more. When we model persons or humans or subjects in social science research in general, because they can't capture 1,000 time points of Mohammed or Alex or whoever, we think that we capture data from 1,000 people that will get all the differences possible or the situations. And then we see, okay, if that person angry, they cannot really drive well. If that person does something, this something, then we get all the variations. And if we get variations from so many people, this technically mirror what can happen in any individual person across this many situations. Is it clear, or shall I say it in a different way? Yeah, so what we get here is inter-individual variance or differences, and by collecting them, we think they mirror here. But that's absolutely wrong. Somehow it does, somehow it doesn't, but many times it doesn't. We give a very important example we call Simpson paradox. Simpson paradox is really cool. And it has been found in many places. For example, if we think that people who type a lot are really fast in typing, yes? So there is, or this is actually heart attack. This is really even nicer. It's usually said that people who have exercise a lot are less likely to have a heart attack. Yes, they are healthy, their heart is strong, but we all know that most heart attacks happen when people actually exercising. That's the case. When you stress the heart a lot, you get more likely to get angina or myocardial infarction or such. So these are two opposite directions. People, for example, who type fast, they are fast in typing, they make less mistakes. But within the people who type fast, the faster they type, the more they make mistakes. So there are two opposite directions. And in the general level, it's an inverse relationship. And in the person level, it's the opposite. This is a positive here, negative there. And there is a very, very famous paper published in the Proceedings of National Academy of Science, PNAS, that tried it in 36 constructs, and they found that they all different between and within person. Within the person themselves, their variations have a completely different variance than the between person things. And I give another example. If you look at the stock market, for example, the stock market, if you see, for example, the stock market in the US today after Trump win and such, maybe it gained 100 or 200 points. That doesn't mean that each and every stock has gained this exact one. Some of them has gone down, some of them has gone up. And if you look at the variations within the stocks, for example, NVIDIA is going insane because of AI. And other ones, Apple is not, maybe Microsoft has gone really good, Apple is suffering, and Google is whatever. So the variations within the stock is different than the variation within the stock market as a whole. The stock market, we look at it as a group-based one. Anyway, let's give another example. What we do usually by looking at group-based research or taking a sample, we call it variable-centered research. And for that, we create a model for people. Another way is to look at person-centered research. Person-centered is to look at variations within the data. Some people are having this, some people having that. So we can get some clusters within the data that have different things. Or idiographic research. In idiographic research, we develop a model for each and every single person, because each and every single persons are really different. And this is what we did in that paper, which was not actually a paper, it was some editorial. And we captured some kind of random data set from the internet. We head to the first two variables in the data, and we tried to create three models. A model that we call group-based research, which is like that, which we assume that will generalize to everyone, like our all research is. And we find that there is a positive correlation between task value and happiness. When the students are working in a task they like, they're happy. I think this is very understandable, very predicted, reported. We did 3, 4, 5 different regression models with different ways, and yeah, everything is really perfect. And then we used a little bit sophisticated model that looks at heterogeneity within the data. And this is what we found. We found 2 different regression lines, one that is negative. Some students were really not happy when they liked the task, when they work on it. We don't know why. We didn't investigate that. And some people are really very happy. And that makes us really take one step back and think, when we find some finding, does it apply to everyone or not? Because it definitely applies to some people, and these people may be the majority, but definitely also maybe not applying at all, and maybe even hurting some people by taking these conclusions. But then we fitted a regression model for every single person in the data. And this is what I call person-specific research. You can find here that it's negative in this exact person, so we know which person exactly that didn't like the task when they really like it, or they're not happy when they like a task, and some other people, and yeah. So we here can pinpoint to every single person what exactly that person is by using this microscopic type of research. So how do we solve that? We solve it by embracing complexity and embracing heterogeneity and embracing that we have individual differences, and we really need, whenever we look at data or we look at whatever conclusions we get, we embrace them. And complex systems are really, really huge thing. And one big part of it is heterogeneity, that we have individual differences and the system behaves in different ways in different situations among different people. So what is actually a complex system? How long did I go? So a complex system is, the word complexity itself means multifaceting, means different components, different parts within the system. And these multiple components interact with each other in a way that you cannot understand the whole system if you reduce it to parts of it. For example, if you look at self-regulated learning, you cannot understand it only by understanding planning, isolated from task enactment, isolated from evaluation or reflection or metacognition. You cannot understand many things by just taking some parts outside. And that system is also dynamic at changing time. And of course, that system behaves differently across different levels. I will not go into definition, we already say it. So there, again, let's go to the definition. Usually there are two traditions of research, something we call component dominant system, which we can use in regression models. A plus B results in C. That's very simple as that. And technically, if you have some experience with regression models, all variables have to be by definition independent. There is no multicollinearity within the variables. This is a condition that we have to have. But that is technically surreal and imaginary and impossible because things interact with each other. But in a complex system, it's interaction dominant. There are interactions between these variables by default. They interact with each other and they change over time, which can definitely be represented as a network. I don't know where is my cursor, like here. Yeah, so does learning follow complex systems? This is a very big question. Of course it does, because whenever you go in any learning framework, it is organized into parts, into components. These components interact with each other. Take, for example, self-regulated learning. It has phases. In some frameworks, some people call them components, elements, processes. And these processes interact with each other and affect each other and change in time and unfold in time. Take engagement, you have behavioral engagement, affective engagement, cognitive engagement, social engagement, whatever people, how they put it, they interact with each other and they change with each other all the time. And take the person themselves, collaborative work, teamwork, wherever you go, you will find the components, their interactions and their changes, which are widely really known. And even if you go to the writing, if you dig into the writing of the great theories, for example, these are just parts of the self-regulated learning. Zimmerman, for example, said self-regulated learning or self-regulation is a complex system of interdependent processes, which is at the absolute definition of complex system. When he said SRL is complex, dynamically changeable, and contextually sensitive, which is, again, absolutely fitting the true definition of complex system. And I like this from, I don't know how to say her name, Buckertz. She's a really great scientist, French, I think, a great theoretician. She said it's impossible to describe how successful students self-regulate unless one adopts a system approach to the study of self-regulated learning. It's everywhere in the writing, but ever since it's hardly operationalized in our research or methods or how we address such things. And it's, as I said, it's everywhere. I think the second part will be Sonsoles part.
Okay. To continue with this complexity lens, I think we now will see some of the main characteristics that make complex systems complex, and hopefully see some examples from the literature, mostly from our own work, to see how these properties actually, appear from the data that we have. So one of the most famous, or the used concepts that are related to complex systems is the notion of attractor states. So basically, the idea of attractor states is that we have some state in our complex system that is stable, that by default, if we do nothing, the system will evolve towards. And the word attractor state or even stability suggests that's something positive, but that's not necessarily the case. So as an attractor state can be a negative state, for example, a student that is disengaged, which means that unless we do something and put some effort, the person will remain stuck in this attractor state. Of course, we also have positive attractor states, like very good students that is engaged, that normally, even if something happens in their life that might, compromise his or her studies, then probably the person, since they're very fixed in this attractor state, they will not be, affected by these changes. So we always, of course, have to try to take students towards the positive attractor states. But the key thing about complex systems is that they're very sensitive to initial conditions. So how a student starts, for example, experiences of first-year students in university, very slight changes can lead them to have a trajectory that will take them to a very bad attractor state or to a very good one. For example, they have a very supportive teacher at the beginning, they might, get in a trajectory of success. Whereas if they have like a negative initial experience with their classmates, or even with something not really that related to school, like housing problems, they might kind of get stuck in a bad trajectory. So very small changes at the beginning can really lead to kind of permanent changes in the system state. Of course, we can, with some effort, get out of the bad attractor states through interventions. But another main characteristic of complex system is that they're nonlinear. So whatever we might think that will cause very big changes, because we're making a very big effort, for example, through curriculum change, completely remodel our curriculum, our study plan, our courses, might actually completely not have any effects, at least not the desired effect in the system. Whereas something very small, like, for example, just having positive feedback to the student, or something that we would never think that is so impactful, may cause kind of like a spiral of positive change and completely change the state of the system. And part of this nonlinearity is caused by the existence of something called feedback loops. So, for example, if we think about engagement and motivation and achievement, if we increase, for example, a student's motivation through positive feedback, for example, that might lead them to be more engaged and therefore better achievers. And through good achievement, they want to become more motivated and more engaged, and so it can kind of spirals out of control. And that's why they have this multiplicative effect in the effect of our interventions. When we actually manage to take the system from a state to a completely different state, sometimes we see like very, very big changes on how things are connected in the system, especially if we take the system from a attractor state to a different one. And the thing is that in this transition, very many things happen, and at some points the system can kind of be stuck in a not balanced state. So this periods of transition are called phase transitions, and it's very hard to model, what happens and kind of predict what will happen in that time and what will be at the end of the tunnel after the phase transition. So that's another thing that adds to the complexity of complex systems, this kind of transitory periods. And lastly, I think it's the last one. Whenever we get in a feedback loop of different parts of the system, for example, if we're talking about collaboration, collaborative learning, we might have some interactions of students, for example, discussing something, giving feedback to each other, and that might eventually lead to, for example, shared knowledge. And that is an emergent pattern that emerges from the interaction between the different parts of the complex system that was not there to begin with. So it's an emerging thing that happens from the interactions within the complex system. Another, a very big example of complex system is engagement, that, as we saw from the examples from Mohammed earlier, is not just the sum of emotional engagement, cognitive engagement, and behavioral engagement, but rather these different components interact with one another, and of course with external contextual factors like family, friends, whatever, and together they form this complex system that is engagement, rather than just being a simple sum of the parts. We'll now see one of the big methods to model complex systems. There's many, of course. This is the one that Mohammed and I mostly work with. It's called psychological networks. And in this, networks are very suitable methods in general to model complexity, because you can see all of the parts of the system and how they're connected. And in these networks, each node, its circle, may model different construct or behavior, or if we think, for example, of a survey, each item, each different question could be a node. And the edges, so the lines that tie together the nodes, are the correlations, or more specifically partial correlations between the variables. Partial correlation means that it's kind of like usual correlation, but it means that two variables are correlated after controlling for the influence of all other variables. So if in a network, if two variables are not connected, that doesn't mean that they're not correlated. This means that their correlation is probably explained by the connection to other variables and not only by their own connection. Psychological networks are also commonly regularized, which means that they're kind of simplified a little bit, or that very complex relationships are penalized when creating the psychological network model, to just point our attention, or kind of to just not exaggerate, but let's say prioritize the strongest connections, so we can better understand the system. And this method has been used a lot in the social sciences and especially psychology. That's why they're called psychological networks. And now, lately, used in education and learning analytics specifically. So to construct these networks, we usually start from our raw data, in which we have several variables, and ideally we have several repeated measures for each subject for each of the variables. Then we build our different models, and we create the partial correlations for each pair of variables, and then we represent that using a psychological network. So let's see some examples of how we have operationalized this method with different types of data. In the first example, we're using this weekly questionnaire of concise questionnaire of self-regulated learning. We have 6 variables: classic self-regulated learning, motivation, efficacy, task value, planning, effort, and evaluation. So students were responding to these questions each week. So it's not like they were replying about how they are about these aspects in general, but that specific week, kind of already acknowledging that self-regulated learning is not something that is kind of stable or permanent, kind of like a personal trait or characteristic, but rather something that is changing throughout time. So first we looked at the data using a kind of naive classic approach, right? So the distribution of the variables. So first we used the responses at the beginning, first few weeks of the course, and at the end of the course. And as you can see, there was barely any differences. So at the beginning, and the end, the distributions of responses were pretty much the same, except for one, which is task value. But when we looked at the responses using psychological networks, we actually saw very many differences. The first network is for the beginning of the course, and the second one is for the end, and the third one is kind of the subtraction of one minus the other. So, for example, we see that the relationship between planning and evaluation was quite strong at the beginning of the course, but not so much at the end. Same with planning and task value. And we see also kind of opposite, the opposite phenomenon. At the end, we see a strong relationship between evaluation and motivation, which was not there yet. And also between task value and, no, sorry, that was the other way around. Between task value and effort, yeah. So we see that even though the distribution of responses, the between person variance of each variable was pretty much the same, we see that indeed there was big differences on how these variables were connected for the different subjects, research subjects, and that changed throughout time. So we have seen now how we can look at self-regulated learning using a complex systems lens, but actually self-regulated learning, we could think that it belongs itself to a more complex system of different constructs like motivation, for example, that in itself could be another complex system of intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. Emotions, of course, are, we'll see actually an example later about how they can also be modeled as a complex system. So actually one of the main characteristics of complex system that kind of allows us to put some cuts somewhere to be able to understand them is that they're hierarchical. So we actually model self-regulated learning just as a bubble in a bigger complex system. We see that it is actually not that much related to these other constructs compared to how much they're related to each other. So in this system, competence and autonomy and motivation and emotion were kind of very correlated to one another, but self-regulated learning and relatedness were not so much. So maybe we are missing another bubble that will explain the disconnections, or maybe we shouldn't just put these things together because they don't form a complex system on its own. We have mostly talked about the connections between the different nodes in the network, but we have not really paid attention so much to the nodes themselves. If you notice, each node has this kind of pie in the edge that sometimes is very like halfway filled, like competence, or sometimes it's very small, like relatedness. And that actually indicates the R squared of each variable, which means how predictable or controllable these nodes are. So basically what they mean is how much each node can be explained by the rest of the network variables. So the usefulness of this is that sometimes we might have a variable that is very predictable, for example, competence, but we can't directly act upon competence because it's not something that is let's say that we can do anything about. But if it's highly predictable or highly controllable, that means that if we act upon the other variables that we can control, for example, let's say changes in curriculum or positive feedback or something that we actually can do, and the variable is highly controllable, that means that we possibly, by acting upon these more like easier variables to control, we can get effects on the variables that we would wish to improve rather than acting directly upon them. But of course, these things do not apply in the same way to everybody, linking to what Mohammed was saying before about heterogeneity. We saw in this same data we were looking at 1 minute ago, the differences between students from Finland and students from Austria. And even though they're supposedly not that different, we saw that indeed the connections in the network were completely different for the two countries. In Finland, weirdly enough, which is, I wouldn't say that they're a highly emotional country, the emotion and competence were very, very linked. But in Austria, there were not that much, and actually there was much more connections for the other variables in the network, like competence, autonomy, motivation. So it was interesting to see, you know, that how the interactions between the different constructs really vary by country. Something else that we can do, since we're representing a complex system as a network, is actually take advantage of the network structure to calculate centrality measures. If you have used social network analysis, for example, to model collaboration, you're probably familiar with centrality measures that can tell us which are the most central nodes or people. If we're talking about social networks in a team, for example, in group work. But in psychological networks, we can also use these kind of measures to tell us which are the most central nodes of the network. So the ones that are more influential, or the ones that kind of have more importance and that are more related to the rest of the nodes. Typically in psychological networks, we don't use the same types of centrality measures than social network analysis. We use strength and expected influence. And well, they're very similar. Basically, they are the sum of the interactions that each node has. So the more, you know, the stronger the connections and the more connections a node has to the rest of the nodes in the network, the stronger they are. But the difference is that expected, well, they're both the sum of the connections, but expected influence also takes into account that some connections might be negative. So for strength, it's like the absolute value of each connection, while for expected influence, it takes into account the sign. So if we look at, for example, the difference between the two networks that we just saw, Austria versus Finland, we see that the central nodes are different for each one. For Finland, the most central node is competence. That drives the entire network and is the most connected node to everything else. Whereas for Austria, well, it also seems to be competence, but it's quite closely followed by motivation, which for Finland is quite lower. So we see significant differences between which are the drivers of each country. I think we should. Should we move to the ideographic then, Mohammed? Yeah, okay. So let's more examples of psychology yeah.
Okay, so the last part of the presentation, we'll look at the ideographic one or person-specific ones. And in these ones, we look at creating a model for each person specifically. And for that, for example, if you look at the first person, try to be, I don't know if I can see or not, but you can see, for example, that an anxiety is not well connected to, or negatively connected to, I don't know if it's enjoyment and motivation. And in the other person, it is only connected to enjoyment. And you can see that metacognition is not connected to any other node. In the other person, metacognition and goals and enjoyment are connected. In the third one, everyone is connected to everyone is positive. In other ways, we can create a specific model for every person. And whenever you get some data about that person, you can be sure that these insights apply to that person. And in the other study, we gathered data from so many people, and we created predictive model for everyone. And you can see that the predictability ranged from 0 to almost 1. Some students were perfectly predictable, and some of students were absolutely unpredictable no matter what. The R-square was almost 0. We tried several models, we tried several combinations, we tried everything. These students were absolutely unpredictable, which, yeah, some people are hard to predict. And we looked at the variables, and these are the top 5 variables. In 18 students, none of the 18 students had the same 5 variables, which is, yeah, you can see now. So the idea that we are similar, even if you look at the average model, it doesn't match any of the students that are in the data. So we are unique, we have individual differences, and the average does not represent many people. And yeah, we already asked the students about that. For example, that student said the centrality seems most correct. When I feel most motivated to complete a task, I enjoy it. It's most important things rather than achieving something through the task. So even students themselves like that person-specific models, and they thought it's really valuable and represents them. I have 2 or 3 students who said this, and it boils down to either we get a universal law for everyone that represents no one already, but possibly represents some people, and it's just like hit and miss, 40, 50, 60, 30, 20% of the data according to whatever you're doing, or doing a law for each profile or each subcluster in the data, just like what I did before, which is much better than just giving something that generalized to everyone. Just like when, for example, you go to a restaurant, there is a vegetarian menu and there is another menu and there's another menu. And we have these individual differences everywhere. But in education, we always think of a magic solution that matches everyone. Or we go really, really specific and we have some kind of a law for a person like Sophia, one other for Layla, another one for Chen. Every one of them has his own, which is something like you go to your family or something, you know, I would like to have this kind of food and such, which would then make you exactly the perfect thing that matches you. And yeah, thank you so much for being here today.
Okay, thanks so much. We've got a microphone we should pass around here. Does anybody have some questions on the chat as well? So can you open the chat, Mohsen, and you'll be able to see the question?
Yeah, I need the glasses.
You would have to go. Okay, all right. So Mohsen, question. Can you just read the question out for the recording as well?
Okay, Mohsen, with regarding to predictability analysis, do you think that collecting more data of those unpredictable cases could help? Longitudinal data. Yeah, unfortunately, this is actually longitudinal data. So collecting more data would help. That's something to be empirically tested. Maybe we did not collect the, thank you so much. Maybe we did not collect okay, some variables about them are unpredictable. That's what we tested. Maybe there are other things that are very predictable in. We collected data about their self-regulation. It wasn't predictable at the time. Maybe others will. But again, the point is that not everything is predictable. And as we usually also give an example, like look at the climate and the weather. The average temperature in Finland weather, which it's usually around -20 or something where we live, but some days are really warm. It could be, for example, +1 or even 0 or -1. So yeah, you can predict that, yeah, Finland winter is cold. That's the average, that's the group average. But it's just the climate is everyday temperature. Sometimes it's -40, sometimes it's -3. So yeah, this is exactly the difference. Like people, at least in Egypt, for example, we used to have so many caricatures about weather predictions because sometimes they say it will not rain and then, you know, it rains really heavily and becomes stormy. That's how unpredictable we are as humans. And if you look at us as individuals. I only see Mohsen. Did
Questions here?
yeah, please.
We have another mic, Scott, but we just need to pass this one out. Okay.
Thank you, Mohsen.
Thank you. In terms of where you're looking at sort of, trying to gather sort of lots of data on an individual over time and sort of accounting for it, like let's model on this individual unit. Do you feel like that is kind of your advice instead of trying to control for sort of groups like demographics and things like that, like rather than trying to account for that variation by finding these group characteristics and things.
If I say it again, did you say that if we collect this data, then we will not need to? Yes, yeah, absolutely, yeah, because gender is stable in that situation. So because, yeah, and everything's stable, for example, like age, gender, background, whatever, these are stable variable, they don't change over time. They sometimes do, but we expect they won't. So yeah, by collecting this multiple or repeated data, you can model that person, but also it comes at a price, because technically when you collect data about that person, that means that whatever works for Ben, for example, wouldn't work for Mohammed, wouldn't work for Simon. So it's really costly to model any single person. It comes at the cost of generalizability. If I, for example, in a restaurant, go there and they make me kind of very, very specific food that I really, really like in my own specific style, they won't sell much of it because it won't generalize to all people who are visiting that place. The more you go specific, the more you lose generalizability.
Right, we also had a point earlier that also might change.
Yeah, for the individual, we might, yeah. Yeah, that's a very interesting one. Yeah, because technically, one of the conditions to model any person that you assume that that person doesn't change over time, but we do. So that modeling, we model it within a period that you think that things will not change in that time. But again, that also makes the system much more complex. It's challenging anyway. Please.
Very thought-provoking presentation, and I was actually connecting to a lot of our work as well, trying to figure out how do we place learners around the use of AI and so forth across the spectrum. And I have so many questions, but in the interest of time, I'll chat with you in more detail. But what is one of the, like, maybe a main advice or in terms of suggestions? So should we actually move away from statistical analysis then? Because that's a main point that people do, right? Like try and figure out large amounts of data, capture like more students, because we do want to try and understand many learners. And that comes with a, yeah, and learning analytics and some of those technologies actually had this promise of scaling and the ability to reach a larger cohort than we just couldn't, right? One teacher to like 1,000 students, but these technologies offered so much of, scalability and so forth. But you also said how important it is to understand individual differences and contexts. So where is the middle ground, and is there a middle ground between the two?
Shall I? Okay, that's a really, really very interesting question. I think when the learning analytics came, there are two very big things about learning analytics, that it had a really, really very strong community, and it comes with a very strong message that we can use a lot of data to do big things, rather than use a lot of data to do very specific things. Because you would understand that if you have much data about me, that you can understand me much better. Not to have much data about me to understand the whole world. So I think scaling is really possible, but you would also understand that scaling doesn't apply to everyone. And that's the whole message I'm saying. And we need to understand that, yes, we can scale, because the data that we collect from many people or group-based data can tell us what works for many people. So at least it's a safe way to start. But when we do it, we need to be cautious, and we need to be understanding that might not work for everyone. It's not like we make it enforceable with a force, everybody should do that. For example, research on homework is really variable. Some people homework work for them. Some people homework doesn't work for them. Some people homework make them actually deteriorate or something. So how that works, some study find fantastic results, some not. we can understand that people are heterogeneous. So we can prescribe homework for people that improve, and people who don't, we can possibly do something else. So scaling is absolutely possible, but we should understand how we apply it, rather than, oh, big data would allow us to understand the world and get one universal law that is just like this. It's, yeah, please.
Sorry, since you asked for middle ground, I think that, I mean, the last part was about ideographic analysis, which is like a lot, like you need a lot of data from each person, which might not be feasible. But here somewhere, let me find the slide. Where is it? Here. So, I mean, if you just stay in the B, that you acknowledge that, okay, there's some differences broadly, you know, upwards, downwards, and no difference. It's better than just staying at the, you know, basic level, admit like without acknowledging that there might be individual differences. So yeah, of course, I mean, it's not the same if this positive line has a slope of 0.2 or 0.8, but at least you know that what you're doing positively affects that person to a, you know, lesser or greater extent. But you also have to acknowledge that if you, for example, add more homework, that might be negative for somebody else. So maybe do not give homework to that person. So, I mean, yeah. So this, if you ask for a middle ground, then this is it, the B. Sorry.
All right. Okay. I'm going to wrap up officially. Okay, so I want to say officially we're going to stop, but those who want to stay and chat, please, let's do that. But let's officially thank the guys for a very interesting conversation. Thanks everybody for joining online, and we'll keep chatting here or down the pub. Thanks very much, and also to Scott for managing AV for us today. Thank you. Yes.
Okay, but those who want to hang out, chat, we can, or we can go down the pub. Anyway, don't the microphone now, we can sit around the chat. Yeah, because